Imagine a warm afternoon in the spring of 1925 on Park Avenue in Manhattan. The sunlight slants gently across the wide boulevard, painting long shadows from the elegant apartment buildings. On the 10th floor of a solid brick residence, a large window overlooks the treetops of Central Park, their leaves just beginning to unfurl into a soft green haze. Inside, the living room is filled with a quiet, unhurried elegance, the faint scent of polished wood, the shimmer of light on a crystal vase, and the muffled hum of the city far below. This is the world that welcomed Jerome David Salinger, known to his family as Sonny, on the first day of January in the year 1919. His father, Sol Salinger, was a successful importer of fine cheeses and meats, a man of precise habits and finely tailored suits. His mother, Marie, had changed her name to Miriam and devoted herself to creating a home that felt both refined and comfortable. She adored her only son and filled his early years with music, picture books, and long strolls through the leafy paths of Central Park. The little boy would stop to watch the rowboats on the lake, their oars dipping silently into the water, leaving ripples that caught the afternoon light. There was a gentleness to these early days, a sense of being sheltered from the louder currents of the world. The apartment itself was a landscape of quiet corners. In the dining room, a heavy mahogany table gleamed under a low-hanging lamp, and the wallpaper carried a faint pattern of trailing vines, repeated endlessly like a soft whisper. Young Sonny often curled up on a velvet settee near the window, tracing the design with his finger while the radiator sighed its warm breath into the room. Outside, the distant clatter of a horse-drawn carriage mingled with the newer sound of automobile engines, but inside, time seemed to move at a slower, gentler pace. It was a childhood suspended in amber light. By the age of 5, Sonny had already developed an intense curiosity for the shape of words. He would sit on the Persian rug in the library, a picture book open on his lap, sounding out syllables to the rhythm of the ticking grandfather clock. His mother would read to him in the evenings, her voice a soft melody that drifted through the dim room as the last light faded from the sky. The stories she chose were often about faraway places, and the boy's imagination would travel to those distant hills and quiet villages, carrying the glow of the lamp with him into sleep. As he grew a little older, the streets of the Upper West Side became his classroom of observation. The neighborhood was a tapestry of small moments, the iceman hauling a dripping block up the service stairs, the nannies in starched uniforms pushing elaborate baby carriages, the soft clinking of milk bottles left on stoops in the early dawn. Sonny walked to school along Riverside Drive, where the Hudson River stretched out like a sheet of silver, and the ferryboats traced slow arcs toward the Palisades. He saw, with an almost painterly attention, how the morning mist softened the edges of the distant cliffs, how the street lamps flickered on one by one as dusk gathered. His schooling took him first to a small, progressive institution on the west side, where the rooms smelled of chalk dust and floor wax and the windows were too high for a child to see out of easily. He was a boy who seemed to be quietly observing everything, his dark eyes missing little. Teachers noted his sharp intelligence and a certain reserve, a tendency to slip away into his own thoughts during recess. He was not unhappy, but he already carried a watchful stillness, as if he were gathering up the details of the world to store them somewhere safe inside himself. When he was 12, the family moved to a larger apartment on Park Avenue, an address that symbolized the solid comfort of their life. The new building had a uniformed doorman and a brass elevator that gleamed under a small chandelier. From his bedroom window, Sonny could see the rooftops marching southward, a sea of tar and water towers that softened into a gray blur at the horizon. At night, the city transformed into a field of scattered lights, each one a small story, and he would sit there for long stretches, listening to the muffled lullaby of the street, already imagining the secret lives behind those distant, glowing windows. The peaceful rhythm of the Park Avenue apartment cracked gently when it was decided that young Sonny, now a restless adolescent, needed the discipline of a boarding school. His parents, Sol and Miriam, looked north toward a place of stone walls and ringing bells, Valley Forge Military Academy in rural Pennsylvania. In the autumn of 1934, The 15-year-old boy climbed into the back of the family car and watched the familiar city dissolve into a patchwork of farmlands and small towns. By the time the car turned onto the long gravel drive that led to the academy, the afternoon light had turned thin and pale, and the first yellow leaves were tumbling across the road. The campus unfolded like a picture of stern order. Neat rows of brick and stone buildings stood against a backdrop of bare hills and gray skies. A central parade ground, its grass trimmed to exactness, led the eye to a white-columned chapel. The air smelled of damp earth and coal smoke, and the only sounds were the distant bark of a command and the steady crunch of footsteps on gravel. This was the world that would later be reimagined as Pensy Prep, the fictional school from which Holden Caulfield would make his lonely escape, and traces of its rigid architecture and colder silences would settle deep into the writer's imagination. Sonny was assigned to a dormitory room with a narrow iron bed and a wooden desk scratched by the generations of boys who had come before him. His window looked out onto a courtyard where the sycamore trees shed their bark in soft, curling strips. At night, the room grew very still except for the occasional clang of a radiator and the distant sound of a bugle playing taps, its notes floating across the dark fields like a series of gentle, fading breaths. In this stripped-down solitude, far from the softness of his mother's reading voice, he began to develop his own inner landscape, one made of words. His greatest solace came from the small drama club and, more importantly, from the act of writing. Under the supervision of a kind English teacher who recognized a flicker of something unusual, Sonny began composing his first short stories in a lined notebook. He would sit at that wooden desk during the long study hours, the lamp casting a small cone of yellow light, and fill the pages with tales of cities and elevator operators and children who said unexpectedly wise things. The nib of his pen scratched in a steady, unhurried rhythm, and the other boys, bent over their algebra or Latin, paid him no attention. It was in that quiet, monastic atmosphere that the stillness of the writer's life first took hold. Beyond the classroom walls, the academy routine was a series of polished rituals. Mornings began with the sharp sound of a whistle and the swift folding of gray wool blankets. The dining hall echoed with the clatter of cutlery and the subdued hum of 100 boys in uniform, their voices kept respectfully low. On Sunday mornings, the entire corps would march in slow, measured steps to the chapel, the leather of their shoes polished to a dark mirror. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, catching the dust motes and making them float like tiny, weightless lanterns. In these ceremonial hours, a sense of beauty could slip through the strictness, a softness that the boy with the notebook noticed and held on to. When the seasons turned, Valley Forge revealed a quieter kind of beauty. In the deep winter, snow blanketed the parade ground and muffled every sound, turning the landscape into a silent, ghostly field of white. The bare branches of the elms traced fine dark lines against a pale sky, and the stone walls of the academy seemed to glow faintly in the twilight. Sonny would walk alone along the plowed paths, his breath making small clouds, and feel a strange, almost painful contentment. The world, he was learning, could be both harsh and tender, and the truest moments often arrived in the softest light. After 2 years, he left Valley Forge without a diploma, but carrying something far more durable, a deepening need to capture fleeting experience on paper. As the car carrying him home turned back toward New York, the hills of Pennsylvania receded into a gray-blue distance. The young man leaning his head against the window had already started to see the world not as a series of events, but as a collection of images and voices, all of them waiting to be transformed into the kind of quiet, truthful sentences he would spend the rest of his life trying to write. Returning to the rhythms of Manhattan in the late 1930s, the young Jerome David Salinger carried his notebook like a passport. His father wanted him to learn the meat and cheese trade, to bury his hands in the cold, practical world of commerce, so he sent the boy to study the business in the Polish city of Bydgoszcz and later to butcher a hog in the Vienna countryside. These brief, stark experiences, the sharp smell of a slaughterhouse, the gray stillness of a foreign town at dusk, only pushed him deeper into the sanctuary of words. At night, In rented rooms that smelled of unfamiliar soap and old wool, he wrote short sketches and dialogues, his fountain pen moving over cheap paper with a quiet, urgent determination. When the war clouds gathered over Europe, Salinger came home and enrolled in a writing class at Columbia University, taught by Whit Burnett, the editor of Story magazine. The classroom was a modest, book-lined room where the afternoon light fell in dusty rectangles across the floor. Burnett, a man with gentle eyes and a soft, encouraging voice, read the young man's stories and saw something electric in the precision of his sentences. That recognition, as simple and life-altering as a key turning in a lock, gave Salinger the confidence to believe that his inner world, so carefully constructed in solitude, could actually touch other people. In the evenings, after the long subway ride back to his parents' apartment, he would climb the stairs to his small bedroom and feed a fresh sheet of paper into a portable typewriter. The machine was a sturdy, olive green Hermes, its keys slightly sticky, its bell chirping at the end of every line. He typed by the light of a single lamp, its shade tilted low to avoid disturbing his mother reading in the next room. The building around him slowly settled into the creaks and sighs of an aging structure, and the street outside grew quiet except for the occasional sigh of a late-night taxicab. In that small circle of light, characters began to breathe, lonely couples in hotel lobbies, soldiers waiting for trains, children who spoke with heartbreaking clarity. The stories that emerged in those hours were not grand historical narratives, they were miniature portraits, each one a careful arrangement of shadow and light. One of his earliest, The Young Folks, unfolded entirely in a living room where the silence between young people felt heavier than any dialogue. The writing was precise, stripped of ornament, yet it shimmered with the unspoken. The evenings he spent revising each paragraph, crossing out a word here, adding a semicolon there, felt like the slow, patient work of a watchmaker. Each finished page was laid gently on a growing pile by the windowsill, where the morning sun would find it and catch the slight indentation of the typed letters. By the time the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, Salinger was beginning to sell his stories to magazines like Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post. The checks were modest, but they proved that a quiet life built around the typewriter was possible. He moved out of his parents' home and rented a small room not far from the Hudson, a space that overlooked the worn stone courtyard of a church. Pigeons cooed softly on the ledge, and the bells rang the hours in a slow, bronze sequence. There, in that modest retreat, with the river wind rattling the window frame, he drafted the first glimpses of a family named Glass, bright, fragile children who spoke in riddles and felt too much. Then the war itself swept him out of that quiet room and into the chaos of Europe. He landed on the beaches of Normandy, walked through the shattered hedgerows of France, and entered the cold horror of a liberated concentration camp. He carried a portable typewriter in his pack and typed whenever the world paused long enough for him to hear his own thoughts. The experience marked him in ways he would rarely discuss, stripping away any remaining illusions about the safety of ordinary life. Yet, even in the midst of that darkness, the habit of writing endured, a small, steady flame cupped in his hands against a powerful wind. When he returned from the war, the city that welcomed him felt both familiar and impossibly distant. The carriage was replaced by a quiet resolution to write something that could hold the weight of everything he had seen, not directly, but through the eyes of a boy who could not bear the world's falseness. He unpacked his typewriter in a new apartment on East 57th Street and, in the pale light of early mornings, began the long, slow composition of the story that would become The Catcher in the Rye. The sound of the keys was soft and regular, like a distant heartbeat, marking the beginning of a quiet revolution. The years immediately after the war were quiet ones for the 30-year-old writer. In a small, sunlit apartment on East 57th Street, Salinger constructed his novel the way a carpenter builds a finely fitted cabinet, slowly, with exacting care, and with a reverence for the grain of each sentence. The apartment itself was spare and orderly, a wooden desk placed against a wall that had once been white, a single bookshelf holding a few volumes of Dostoevsky and Flaubert, and a large window that framed the upper branches of a ginkgo tree. On spring mornings, the tree's fan-shaped leaves filtered the sunlight into a soft, green-tinged glow that moved across the floorboards as the hours passed. The voice that emerged on the page was unlike anything the literary world had heard, a raw, intimate, and startlingly alive first-person torrent that seemed to bypass the distance between reader and writer. The narrator was a 16-year-old boy named Holden Caulfield, standing on a hill overlooking a football game, feeling alienated from the entire world. Salinger wrote and rewrote each passage, reading the sentences aloud to himself in the silence of the empty room, testing their rhythm. The pacing had the music of a late-night conversation, full of digressions and sudden, piercing truths. Layer by layer, chapter by chapter, the novel grew into a complete and fragile object, like a paper lantern that held a fierce, steady light. The title, The Catcher in the Rye, came from a single, luminous image in the text, Holden's dream of standing at the edge of a cliff of rye, catching children before they fall. It was a metaphor of immense tenderness, a vision of protection that the author himself seemed to long for. In the chapters leading up to that revelation, Salinger conjured a wintry New York City of taxicabs and cheap hotels, of cold stairwells and the carousel in Central Park. The prose shimmered with the ordinary, yet every detail, the smell of wet wool, the scratch of a bad record, the way dusk settled over the pond, carried a subtle weight of sadness and beauty. He was building a world that felt uncannily real, as if the reader had stepped through a door into someone else's long, sleepless night. When the novel was finally published in the summer of 1951, it arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, accumulating force. The jacket was a modest maroon color with no author photograph, only a note that he did not desire publicity. Salinger had asked his publisher, Little, Brown and Company, to avoid any promotional circus, and they, in a rare gesture of respect, agreed. Nevertheless, word spread from reader to reader, passed hand to hand like a secret. In college dormitory rooms and on park benches, people read passages aloud, stunned by Holden's voice, so honest, so full of grief and humor and longing. The book became not just a bestseller, but a companion, a thing that readers felt had been written especially for them. The writer, however, found the sudden attention suffocating. The city streets that had once been his quiet observatory now seemed to hum with an invasive curiosity. Strangers approached his apartment building, letters piled up on the hall table. The very privacy he needed to do his work was dissolving. Salinger began to realize that the voice he had given the world, that pure and boyish voice, was now demanding something from him that he could not give, a public self, a performer's face. So he did a thing that would define the rest of his life. He began to withdraw, not out of anger, but out of a deep, instinctive need to keep the silence around his work intact. Even before the novel's release, he had started to look beyond the canyons of Manhattan. He bought a small, second-hand Jeep and drove north, following the Hudson River until the skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror and the road narrowed into winding country lanes. In that greener, quieter world, the air smelled of pine and freshly turned earth, and the only sounds were the whispering of leaves and the distant lowing of cattle. In those drives, he glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of life, one built around the steady rhythms of the seasons, where a man could sit at his desk with nothing but the sound of the wind to compete with the sound of his own typewriter. The seed of his future was planted on those long, wandering drives. As the acclaim for The Catcher in the Rye grew beyond anyone's expectations, Salinger took the final, decisive step. He found a piece of land on a quiet hill in Cornish, New Hampshire, a place of rolling meadows and old stone walls, where the Connecticut River curved silently below. There was a modest farmhouse there, shaded by ancient maple trees, and a small barn that he imagined turning into a writing studio. In the late autumn of 1952, he packed his typewriter, his notebooks, and a few favorite books, closed the door of the East 57th Street apartment for the last time, and drove north into the stillness that would become his permanent home. The world that Holden Caulfield inhabited, the world of 19,500's New York that Salinger had so precisely rendered, was already becoming legendary by the time its author began his quiet life in the New Hampshire hills. Readers who had never set foot in the city felt they knew the smell of the lobby of the Edmont Hotel, the hard, cold feel of the stone wall by the carousel in Central Park, the dim silver light of a record shop on a snowy afternoon. The novel, only about 200 pages, had managed to capture not just a character, but an entire atmosphere of longing and loss, the way a certain quality of light at 4 o'clock on a winter's day can make the world feel unbearably tender and sad. In the small farming towns around Cornish, however, very few people knew that the tall, soft-spoken man who had recently moved into the old farmhouse on the hill was responsible for that literary sensation. To the townspeople, he was simply Mr. Salinger, a quiet neighbor who walked the country roads in a worn canvas jacket, sometimes stopping to talk to a farmer about the weather or the health of a horse. He was polite, even gentle, but he carried with him a distinct boundary, an invisible fence that everyone somehow sensed and respected. The postmistress noticed that he collected bundles of fan mail, which he carried home and stacked, unopened, in a corner of the barn. The barn became the center of his daily life. It was a modest, weathered structure with a slanted roof and 2 small windows that looked out over a sloping meadow. Inside, he built a simple workspace, a plywood desk, a straight-backed chair, and a small wood stove that glowed orange in the winter months. On the walls, he tacked a few photographs, scenes of the Cornish countryside in autumn, a snapshot of his young son and daughter much later, and a carefully typed note to himself reminding him to keep the work pure. The silence in that room was so complete that he could hear the soft rustle of birds in the eaves and the distant, mournful whistle of a freight train passing through the valley. The years that followed were ones of intense, private creation. Salinger rose early, just as the first gray light touched the hills, and walked the perimeter of his property. The dew on the grass clung to his shoes, and the pines gave off a cool, resinous scent. By the time the sun had lifted above the tree-line, he was at his desk, his fingers resting on the keys of the typewriter. He was writing, he would later tell a rare interviewer, but for himself, for the pleasure of getting the words exactly right. The Glass family stories that had begun in New York now expanded into a rich, intricate cycle, full of spiritual searching and the delicate architecture of childhood. In the village itself, life moved at a slower, kinder pace. The general store, with its creaking wooden floor and barrels of flour, served as the social heart of the community. On Tuesdays, when the bread delivery arrived, the air inside was warm with the scent of yeast. Salinger would occasionally appear there in the late morning, exchanging a few calm words with the shopkeeper, buying a tin of coffee and a newspaper. He walked back up the hill with a steady, unhurried stride, a solitary figure growing smaller against the expanse of the green landscape. The locals learned to protect him, deflecting the rare curious journalist with legendary politeness and, sometimes, a bit of creative misdirection. Meanwhile, Holden's voice continued to spread across the globe, translated into dozens of languages, embraced by generations of young people who saw themselves in his confusion and his fierce, tender ethics. The book became a quiet staple of nightstand reading, its pages worn soft by many hands. And in the farmhouse on the hill, Salinger continued to write, filing the finished manuscripts away in a large safe. The silence around him deepened. He refused publication, refused interviews, refused to have his photograph taken. This was not bitterness or eccentricity. It was a profound conviction that the work itself was the only thing that mattered, and that the noise of fame would, like a strong wind, blow out the delicate flame of creation. As twilight fell over the hill on a typical evening, the scene was one of complete and unbroken peace. The lights of the farmhouse windows glowed warm against the deep blue of the sky. The maple trees stood motionless, their leaves a dark silhouette. Inside, the writer might have been preparing a simple supper of soup and bread, or reading one of the spiritual texts he loved, or simply sitting by the window, watching the first stars appear above the dark ridge of the mountains. The story of Holden Caulfield had been given to the world, but the man who created him had chosen a different ending, not an ending at all, but a long, sustained quiet in which the next story could slowly, patiently take shape. As the decades rolled gently over the New Hampshire hills, the farmhouse known simply as the Salinger place became less a residence and more a state of being. The long gravel driveway, lined with black-eyed Susans in summer and crusted with frost in winter, led upward into a world governed by the slow, dependable rhythms of the seasons. In the spring, the hillside erupted in washes of pale green and the scent of lilacs drifted through open windows. In autumn, the sugar maples turned a brilliant gold and the entire property seemed to be on fire with a soft, quiet light. This was the only stage upon which the writer now chose to live, a landscape of incredible peace. His daily ritual remained remarkably unchanged for more than 50 years. Morning after morning, he would wake before the birds began their full chorus, light the stove, and make a pot of strong coffee. Sitting at his kitchen table, he would open a spiral notebook and write longhand letters, fragments, spiritual meditations. The view from that window was a constant comfort, the mist rising from the river bottom, the sharp outline of Mount Ascutney in the distance, the slow passage of cloud shadows across the meadow. He had simplified his life down to these essential elements, and in that simplification had found a spaciousness that many people spend a lifetime seeking. The writing continued, unseen and unheard. He filled notebooks with a steady, careful hand, the words accumulating in the safe like geological strata. His neighbors, who had long ago absorbed his presence into the natural order of things, never pried. On warm afternoons, they might see him sitting on a wooden bench under the big elm at the edge of his property, a book open on his knee, his attention lifted toward the sky. The scene was so ordinary and so beautiful, an elderly gentleman in a flannel shirt, the grass alive with crickets, the distant sound of a lawnmower, that it felt like a painting waiting to be captured. In the later years, his connection to the local community remained gentle but authentic. He served quietly on the board of the Cornish library and sometimes attended the small Sunday service at the white-steepled church, where the hymns were sung in thin, wavering voices and the light streamed through plain glass windows onto the wooden pews. He was known to stop by the town hall on voting day, filling out his ballot in the cramped booth, exchanging a quiet nod with the town clerk. These small, civic rituals anchored him to the human world in a way that felt sustainable, far from the roar of the New York literary scene. The silence he cultivated was not an absence, but a presence. It was the silence of deep winter when the snow piled up on the branches of the hemlocks and the only sound was the distant crack of a frozen branch. It was the silence of summer noons when the heat shimmered over the meadow and the bees drowsed among the clover. Into this silence, he poured his own voice, not for publication, not for posterity, but as a form of breathing, a way of being fully alive. Those few who were permitted inside the farmhouse reported a space of utter calm, books stacked neatly, a few Asian art objects, the faint, pleasant smell of old wood and coffee. In the late afternoons, as the sun dipped behind the western ridge, the light turned thick and golden, pouring through the dusty barn windows in long, slanted shafts. This was the hour Salinger loved best. He would put aside his pen and walk slowly up the hill behind the house, to a spot where the view opened up to show the whole Connecticut River Valley. Standing there with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, he resembled nothing so much as one of his own characters, a thoughtful, solitary figure at the edge of a great, beautiful expanse, not falling, but standing witness. The river below was a ribbon of silver, the hills beyond a blue-gray haze. It was a landscape that asked for nothing and gave back an enormous, quiet peace. J.D. Salinger died on a day in late January 2010 in the same farmhouse where he had lived for nearly 60 years. The snow was deep that winter, and a hush lay over the hill. He was 91 years old. The news traveled softly around the world, like the echo of a single bell. In the days that followed, people left copies of The Catcher in the Rye on the stone wall by his driveway, their pages ruffled by the cold wind. But the house itself remained quiet, its windows dark, keeping its secrets. The story of the boy from Park Avenue who became a literary icon and then chose silence had come to its natural end. Yet, in a very real sense, the quiet continues. The pages he left behind, locked in that safe, wait in the dark for a time he asked to come. The farmhouse still stands, and the hill still turns green each spring. And in the long, quiet reaches of the night, when an insomniac somewhere opens the catcher in the rye and hears Holden Caulfield's voice, steady as a heartbeat, the pact Salinger made with the reader is renewed. He gave the world a voice of absolute honesty, and then he gave himself the deep, restorative stillness that voice required. In the end, his life was its own kind of masterpiece, a landscape of quiet, where the only sound that mattered was the soft scraping of a pen moving across a page, writing the next true sentence.